All right, well, welcome everybody to our March Fireside Chat. Glad to have you all joining us again. My name is Kirk Hanson. I'm the Director of Forestry for the Northwest Natural Resource Group, and I'm joined by Laura Lynn, our Outreach Coordinator, and Laura's handling the technology in the background, making sure everything goes smoothly here. I'm also joined by Oliver, who probably will come and go as we go along throughout the night. Tonight's topic is on forest restoration, and to be very kind of personal evening for me. I'm going to be showcasing some projects that I've been working on our family's land for the past 5 years or so. And each of these projects I find in my broader work across the Northwest pop up frequently. So I think for a lot of you, as I go through these 4 or 5 projects, we'll likely be able to identify with them. I'm sure that most of you will have these kinds of stand types or forest restoration projects on your land. And I realized when I was putting my presentation together that I actually did something very similar in July of last year for the Fireside Chat. And went through some of these same projects. So this may be a little bit redundant for some of you that have joined us in the past, but I'm going to go into a little more detail about some of these projects. And one of the reasons that I'm showcasing these also is that the USDA funded or provided funding rather towards the cost of each of these projects through the Environmental Quality Incentives Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program. So when I talk about each of these projects, I'm also going to share the kind of financials behind them, what they cost me to implement and what either the EQIP or the CSP program reimbursed me. So you can see the interplay between these federal cost share programs and doing restoration work on private small woodlands. As is the usual format for our fireside chats, this is going to be an hour-long discussion. The first half hour, I'll be presenting about these projects, and then we'll open it up for more general discussion. And I'm hoping that folks will also share some of the restoration projects that you've been working on your own land, because I think that's where some of the richest sharing occurs, just peer-to-peer amongst all of us here in the group. During this first half hour, we're going to keep everybody's mics muted. And if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and put them in the chat function down somewhere at the bottom of the screen. There should be a chat. And Laura will be screening those questions. And once we finish the first half hour, we'll draw from some of those questions initially, and I'll attempt to answer them or maybe even turn them back over to the group for a group answer. And then we'll actually open up into a little more of a group discussion at that point. So with that, I am going to pull up a presentation. And Laura, can you confirm that my presentation is up? Should say common forest restoration practices. Can people see that? Okay,
I see it.
Okay, all right. Well, let's dive into it here. Ollie, you're going to have to stay down there. You're distracting. So like I mentioned, I'm going to cover a range of common forest restoration practices that I come across frequently on the small woodlands that I go out and consult on. But in this case, each of these projects have taken place on my family's Bokota forest, a little bit south of Olympia. My family owns 3 tracts of forest land. We have a piece up near Black Diamond, one out in Oakville, and then this property here in Bokota. And just by way of reference, this is the stand type map for our property. The whole property is about 102 acres. There's roughly 20 acres down in the southeast here, that's wetland. and then 100 acres or so of upland forest. And as you can see with this kind of colorful display of stand typing, there's a lot of different stand types on this property. When we acquired the property, we were able to get it comparatively relatively inexpensively because I considered at the time kind of a problem child. It had been neglected by the previous owner. A lot of timber had been harvested off of it, areas not replanted, a lot of native brush and invasive species had come back into it. But what really, I think, convinced us to buy this land was the soil. And we did what good farmers do, and we bought good soil. This is some of the most productive soils, a Centralia clay loam, some of the most productive soils in the Northwest. And I knew that with some good design and a healthy dose of federal cost share funding, we could tune this property back up, get it well stocked with trees, get it back into long-term timber production, as well as manage it for a broad suite of conservation values. So what I'm going to do is dive into, again, four specific projects that we've worked on since 2018 when we bought the property up to the present moment, and some of these projects are still ongoing. And one of the very first projects was, I should say, this is now past tense, pre-commercially thinning some extremely dense, naturally regenerated red alder stands. So as many of you know, on disturbed soils, if you have alder seed trees in the area, alder will seed onto those disturbed soils and grow up in extremely dense thickets. And that was the case on quite a few acres on this property. I'm going to move some toolbars out of the way here. Excuse me a moment so I can see. So I just brought up a stand summary. So when we acquired the property in 2018, these alder stands were roughly 18 to 20 years old, stocked again at a very high density, in excess of 600 trees per acre. If those were all evenly spaced out, that would be a tree, approximately every 6-8 feet or so. Even though there was a high stocking density and the trees were relatively young, the average diameter was still pretty good, 8 inches in diameter, which speaks to the productivity of the soils. And the heights of the trees were averaging about 52 to 60 feet. The other metric that I looked at in this stand was what's called the average live crown ratio. That's the percent of total tree height that is in live green needles or leaves, in this case of the alder. And so what convinced me that I could pre-commercially thin an 18 to 20-year-old alder stand and get the residual trees to release to continue to grow were kind of three factors. One, again, the average diameters were already 8 inches, so it wouldn't take too many more years of growth for them to get up to sort of an ideal 10 to 12 inch diameter that would make them very valuable saw logs. The other thing is, given the height, the 52 to 60 feet, each of the trees would have at least one, if not two, saw logs in them. And then the last variable, the live crown ratios on the dominant trees and the co-dominant trees, still exceeded 35 to 40%, which told me that if we could release those dominant trees, they would continue, those adequate crowns would continue to drive diameter growth on these trees. So that's, again, what convinced me that I could pre-commercially thin this stand and get it to release. It's 5 years later now. The trees are definitely putting on diameter growth, so it looks like that's proving itself out. But to talk a little bit about some of the tools that I used to determine thinning, there are some handy stand density guides out there, and you can look these up for any number of species. And I put this publication over here by Oregon State University, Competition in Density in Woodland Stands. And if you just Google that title, you'll find this document. And in that document, it's a little different version of this chart that I'm showing you, but it provides charts for most of the common conifer and hardwood species in the Northwest, and provides the sort of optimal density range that trees should be growing in based on their diameter. So the way that you use this chart is you set your target diameter. What diameter do I want to grow this stand out to before I thin it? And then it'll tell you what you should thin that stand down to reach that target diameter. So like I mentioned with the alder, I was aiming for a minimum of 10 inches DBH, or diameter breast height, ideally 10 to 12 inches. So if you look at the red line that I have here, this is the way you use that. You set your target diameter and then run that across, and you're aiming for this gray zone, what they call the management zone there. And then you follow that down, and it shows you the sort of optimal trees per acre, or density, that you should thin that stand to again in order to achieve the target diameter. So for alder, if I'm aiming for roughly 10 inches, a little over 10 inches, I should be thinning that stand down to a little below 200 trees per acre. And now, once you have that in mind, you can adjust that, based on a variety of different factors. With alder or Douglas fir, if you want the trees to self-limb and stay, grow maybe a little bit slower, put on a tighter wood, slower ring count, you leave your stand a little bit higher, or thin to a higher density. If you've got big crowns and really want to drive volume growth, you could thin to a slightly lower density, minimizing competition within the stand. But for alder, we were aiming for this kind of roughly 200 trees per acre as our target thinning density. So in other words, going from the 600 trees per acre down to 200 trees per acre as part of the pre-commercial thinning. There's another stand density guide that I find to be really useful, and this is produced by the USDA. And if you just type in USDA Forest Stand Density Guide, you'll find this document. And what this does is it lists all of the tree species common to the Northwest and organizes them by their shade tolerance, and then shows you in these various columns, again, the density in trees per acre, in this case, stems per acre, SPA, that you should thin the stand down to. It's handy in particular for young stands. You'll see in column B, or column C rather, young stand density. So if you're already dealing with a young stand, like in this case, a naturally regenerated alder stand, you go out and you measure the average diameters out there. And in this case, if the diameters fall within 2 to 9 inches DBH, then this column shows you what you should thin down to keep that stand in optimal growth. And fortunately, the sort of target density here jives with that stand density diagram that I showed you before. And this is saying that we should thin the stand to roughly 200 to 260 trees per acre. And I like that it gives you that range rather than just a hard number. For any of you that have thin stands, in particular naturally regenerated stands, they really lend themselves to thinning to a more of an average range than an average specific density. And then it also puts that density in terms of spacing. So 200 to 260 trees per acre equates to a tree, roughly every 13 to 15 feet. What's important in thinning, though, is not to thin to a perfect spacing, but to thin using some qualifiers, which I will share next here. So this was the thinning prescription that I used for the alder stand. First of all, I did all the thinning myself. It's one of my favorite activities, kind of an instant gratification project. You spend a day out there pre-commercially thinning, you look back, you can see what you've done. It's good to do in the winter time. It's just cooler to work. The leaves are down. You can see what you're doing a little better. And I chose to thin to an average of 180 to 220 trees per acre. And the trees that I targeted for cutting were the most suppressed trees, the trees that were already essentially getting weeded out or thinned out in the stand just through natural canopy suppression. So these were the smallest diameter trees, and also the trees with the smallest live crowns. And in other words, wouldn't likely release if I were to retain them. So I cut those out first. Then I also cut out the highly defective trees that would have little to no future timber value. So they had broken tops or forked tops or excessive sweep. And then after that, I also released, there were some understory conifers, a little bit of grand fir, a little bit of cedar, a little bit of Doug fir in the understory. So I also did a little bit of thinning on the south side of those conifers to try to get more sunlight down to them and release them, because ultimately I want a mixed species stand. And then lastly, once I thinned based on all those variables, I did a little final thinning just for spacing to get the individual crowns of the trees thin so they had ample space in the canopy to continue to grow. There also was some sprouting maple, the multi-stemmed maples in there. And so I would cut those down to 1 to 3 dominant stems. So conversely, the keep trees were the largest diameter dominant trees that had more than 30% live crown. These are the trees that I want to grow up to timber quality to be able to harvest at some point. So they were the trees with the best quality, straight, no defect. I also retained underrepresented hardwood species, cherry, cascara, again, maple. Part of our objective is to maintain biodiversity out there. And then, like I mentioned, we also retained the conifers. So a little financial summary of this, again, roughly 12 acres. The EQIP program at that time, this is 2019, was paying $309 per acre for pre-commercial thinning. So that was a total of roughly $3,700. Like I mentioned, I did the work myself. It takes me about 8 hours to pre-commercially thin an acre. So you take your, 8 hours times 12 acres, divide the $3,600, $3,700 of EQIP funding. It turned out I was paying myself about, $38 an hour. Not bad wages. Paid for a little financial incentive to get out there and do that work anyway. So the next project was a seedling release from both brush and seedling release from competing maple. So like I mentioned, we bought this kind of problem child of a property that had been neglected by the prior owner. That owner had planted a lot of seedlings into existing brush, Himalayan blackberry, and then all sorts of native shrubs. And by the time we came along, those shrubs and blackberry were starting to directly compete with those seedlings. And then on another hillside, he had recently clear cut, replanted that to Douglas fir. But when he clear cut, he had cut the maple, and as is common with maple, the stumps resprouted, and there were so many stumps across this site that as they bushed out in their multi-stemmed, multi-headed hydra fashion, though the crowns of those bushy maples were beginning to suppress the Douglas fir seedlings that had been planted there. So again, I got EQIP funding to address these two seedling release projects. The first one, the seedling release from brush, we did, first of all, both these projects in midsummer after the main growth of the brush and the maple had finished. The seedling release, my folks and myself and my family did ourselves, and we tried a little bit of a study. We used 3 different techniques across about a 5-acre unit to see what would work the best for releasing the seedlings. In one small portion of that, about 1.5 acres, I took a brush cutter and cut down all of the Himalayan blackberry in that area, plus all of the native brush that was directly competing with the seedlings, but retained patches of native shrubs here and there for the biodiversity and wildlife and pollinator value. Then in the second study, we took another about 1.5 acres and cut back all the competing vegetation just within a 3-foot radius of each seedling with a machete. And this was something that my parents specifically did. And then our third study was just to do what I called a crown release of the seedlings. So we just cut back the competing vegetation around the top 1/3 of the seedling to make sure that it stayed exposed to sunlight. And then for the past several years, we've been studying these three areas to see, if there was a benefit one way or the other to any of these. And I can tell you there was not. That all the seedlings just grew perfectly fine, or equally fine, I should say. So maybe the value of the study was more in how long it took us to do each of these practices, and coincidentally or ironically, it took almost exactly the same amount of time, about 8 hours per acre again, with the brush cutter to cut back competing vegetation, as well as 8 hours of machete work on the two different seedling release sites. One caveat to that is that the latter two, the machete work, was both done by octogenarians, so bully for them. My parents were out there with machetes cutting back brush. Perhaps folks are a little younger, could do that a little more quickly, but it shows the value of persistence over time. The seedling release from maple, we hired a contractor to do that. And basically one dude in a chainsaw went through that 9 acres and cut all of the maple sprouts from each of the sprouting stumps, and then made sure that he pulled the cut stems off of any of the dug fir that that they happen to fall on, so the dug fir stayed exposed. So again, looking at the financials of this, the latter, the maple, was roughly 9.5 acres. Equip paid about $309 an acre. Since we hired a contractor, he only cost $150 an acre. Equip pays you that reimbursement rate regardless of what it costs you. So we still got the $309 per acre. So even though it cost us $1,400, Equip paid us about twice that, almost $3,000. And then again, for the roughly 5 acres that we did ourselves, the brush treatment, again, $309 an acre. We put in our own labor at that time. And so that was just direct payment to us and no financial outlay, or no out of pocket. So the third project, a lot of our site, gosh, about 17, almost 18 acres, had been clear cut at some point, not replanted. A whole hodgepodge of maple and vine maple, big leaf maple, vine maple, red alder, cherry, cascara, elderberry, you name it, came back onto this site. And very few conifers in there. So, poor stocking, poor timber quality. And so we went into this site to convert it back to a long-term timber plantation. And these were two different sites. You can see the stocking in there. One of the sites was running less than 90 trees per acre. These would be the dominant overstory trees. The other unit running less than 50 trees per acre. So again, very, very poorly stocked sites. For the site preparation, given that there was so much brush, dense brush in here, along with vine maple and blackberry, I hired a neighbor to come in with his flail mower and basically grind all that brush into mulch. It made an absolutely ideal planting environment for the planting crew that we then hired to come in and plant all of this. So saved some time and cost on that end of things. And I think was just a great way to go versus coming in and trying to do this manually. And at the time I was trying to avoid herbicides also. So this was our preferred strategy. So the planting prescription there was one site that was a little more open and exposed. We planted a 50-50 mix of Douglas fir and cedar at about 260 trees per acre. Keeping in mind there already were some trees on this site, alder, a little bit of maple. And so in combination with those trees, we're trying to get a total stocking density of about 350 trees per acre. Every tree that I plant, I've come to put a bamboo stake next to it with some colored flagging, so when the brush does grow back, we can easily find those seedlings. And then all the cedar were caged with a Vexar mesh tube to minimize browse damage. In the site that had a little more stocking of trees, is also happened to be down in some shady valleys. we planted a 20-40-40 mix of western hemlock, western red cedar, and Douglas fir. There were some gaps and openings where the Douglas fir could grow, but the hemlock and cedar went in the more shady areas and beneath the existing hardwoods. And we planted that unit at about 300 trees per acre. Again, with the existing trees there, that brought total stocking density again to 350 trees per acre. Put a stake next to all the seedlings, tubes on the cedar. And here's the financials on that, just pointing out a few key things. For that mechanical site preparation with the flail mower, one site had very light brush, and so EQIP moderates the payment. It was $621 an acre. And the other site had very heavy brush, and so they pay a higher rate, based on the density of brush. So in that case, about $954 an acre. It averaged out that the cost of the flail mower was about $1,100 per acre, across all of the 17 acres. So again, cost us more out of pocket than what EQIP reimbursed us. Tree planting was about $500 an acre in labor, another $300 an acre in trees and cages and stakes. So, roughly $800 an acre. EQIP paid about $700 an acre. So again, we had some out-of-pocket expense in there. And then EQIP also paid for 3 years of seedling release. So as the brush grew back up, going back in, and we chose to manually cut back the brush, hire crews to do that. And in each year, the cost of the crews went up from $150 an acre to $189 to $204 an acre. And so you can see for the restoration of this site, EQIP paid us $31,000. It cost us $39,000. So we have about $8,000 out of pocket invested in the restoration of those roughly 18 acres. So the very last project is about 20 acres, and this was a mixed alder and Douglas fir stand. It's on some wet slopes that had been clear cut, planted back to Doug fir, but alder naturally regenerated, overtopped the fir in some cases, a lot of fir mortality because of the wet soils. Again, a lot of brush, a lot of Himalayan blackberry. And so our objective in this was to go in and pre-commercially thin the alder and pre-commercially thin the Douglas fir, and then create some wildlife habitat structures. And then lastly, replant the site with the diversity of conifers for the purposes of long-term timber production as well as long-term carbon sequestration. So let's see here, some of the stand metrics. So this stand was already running about 350 to 450 trees per acre. Diameters were pretty good across both the alder and the fir, averaging 8 to 10 inches. But the live crown ratios, were dropping below 40%. So to me, again, good justification for pre-commercially thinning. Also, stocking was highly variable across this site. So some areas had extremely high stocking densities, in particular of the alder. And then there were areas of gaps that were just filled with brush. Very heterogeneous site. So breaking down these 3 activities, we did the pre-commercial thinning in the winter. This 20 acres, I chose to hire a crew to do it. And we thinned the alder again to the same residual density of 180 to 220 trees per acre. Thin the fir just lightly and to a slightly higher density, 240 to 300 trees per acre. And then we hired a contract crew to come in, and they underplanted the alder, planted the gaps, and they kind of planted around the edges of these patches of Douglas fir, but did not plant underneath the Douglas fir. We chose a range of tree species here, and you can see the chart that I just put up and their shade tolerance. So the shade tolerant trees were planted underneath the red alder, and the less shade tolerant trees were planted out in the gaps. And then the last suite of projects is we created 3 different habitat structures, and I, as well as my kids, did these across the 20 acres using the slash from the pre-commercial thinning. We created 4 wildlife habitat piles. We also created 20 downed logs, and these were a combination of both cutting trees that were at least 12 inches in diameter that had poor timber quality and putting them on the ground. And when I ran out of those, then we were able to take smaller poles and pile them in parallel to make constructed habitat logs. And then we also made 26 snags by girdling trees. And the EQIP program requires that logs and snags be a minimum of 12 inches in diameter to be functional for wildlife. And so with these younger stands, it was a little bit hard to find trees of that diameter. And I didn't always want to cut those trees. A lot of those were good timber quality, but some had defect and lent themselves to converting to wildlife structures. And just to show you some photos, on the left is a maple. And if you can see, I put two parallel cuts in around the stem there to cut through the cambium layer and kill the tree. And then I was like putting a W on there for wildlife. It's just kind of fun. And then on this right-hand picture is a constructed log. And as you can see, we piled poles together and then piled some slash on top of that. And then lastly is the ever famous wildlife habitat pile. Larger poles at the bottom that create some little gaps that small mammals can get into, and topped off with branches that little Tweety birds can get in for refuge. And my kids made all of these. So again, we internalize the cost of that. So running through some of the financials of this, the pre-commercial thinning EQIP was paying $340 an acre. It cost us $442. This was very adverse terrain, steep slopes, crawling through a lot of brush. So more expensive than pre-commercial thinning usually is. So again, cost us more than what EQIP paid. And that was paid for by the pre-commercial thinning, the wildlife habitat structures, those two activities were paid for by EQIP. And then the tree planting was paid for by the Conservation Stewardship Program through the practice called planting for high carbon sequestration. And you'll see this $1,700 per acre. So that had to pay for both the site preparation, cutting back the competing vegetation, and planting the trees, putting the bamboo stakes out there, caging the trees. And they pay a lump sum then for all 20 acres, about $35,000 for that. It cost me in labor to plant the trees, $500 an acre. So, substantial earnings off of that, but I have to take that or save that money now and use that to pay for seedling maintenance in years going forward. And you'll see that down here, the seedling release 1. We actually got some small payments for that, but it's costing us roughly $200 an acre or $4,000 every year to have a crew come in and manually clear around those seedlings. So in this case, at the end of this project, between EQIP and CSP, the payment was about $53,000 to restore the 20 acres and cost us $36,000. So, again, we were able to bank a substantial amount of money there, but that's going to go towards, years of seedling maintenance until we can get those seedlings up above the brush height to get to a free to grow. So this summarizes everything, and I just want to cut to the chase down here that over the 5 years now of restoration work on this land, we've invested from federal funding about $92,000. Again, the total cost of the projects has been about $77,000. So again, we still have some money set aside that we can use for seedling maintenance. But that should give you a pretty good idea of how EQIP works and CSP works in helping fund some of these projects. So the last thing I want to let you know, I'm excited to make this announcement, is that NNRG somewhat recently received a large federal grant in partnership with a number of other organizations. And over the next, I believe, about 5 years, we are going to be able to basically run our own EQIP program, our own cost share program. It'll function very, very similar to EQIP, but we will be in control of evaluating projects and working directly with landowners and funding those projects. So if you have restoration projects that you're considering on your land, we can send a forester out, might even be myself, walk your land with you, take a look at what you want to do, And if the project qualifies, there's kind of a specific suite of projects that qualify, then we can fund you directly, and we can fund you essentially immediately rather than waiting, the usual 12 to 18 months for the EQIP funding cycle to go around. So keep that in mind. You'll be seeing an announcement about this new program coming out shortly, but we're excited to be able to offer that to the small woodland owners that we work with. And then lastly, I would be remiss if I did not tell you, if you didn't already know, but Seth and I did a thing. We wrote a book. And this is officially due in bookstores April 1st, but it is available for pre-order right now. You can order through our website. And this is basically a how-to manual for implementing ecological forestry practices in small woodlands. So I encourage you to take a look at our website and read a little bit about the book. And of course, we'd be thrilled if you purchased one. And if you buy through our website, the added incentive is you will get a signed copy. Both Seth and I sat down the other day and signed 180 copies of the book. So we can get those out to folks if you're interested. So I'm going to wrap it up there and open it up. And I don't know, I rattled on so quickly there. I don't know, did any questions come in or pithy comments in the chat function that you can screen for us, Laura?
Yes, I just have the chat went away when you stopped. Up there it is again. Found it. And I did drop the link for the book in the chat, along with any links he said Google during his presentation. I dropped them in there as well. They were easy to find. All right, first question from Scott. To qualify for EQIP or CSP cost sharing, is it necessary to have an approved forest stewardship plan?
So for EQIP, you do. You have to have a forest management plan, and it, excuse me, has to identify the projects that you're seeking EQIP funding for. So you need to have a map of your land and a map that identifies the areas that you want to get EQIP funding to treat. So for instance, if you have 5 acres of pre-commercial thinning, you need to have that mapped out and quantified. So EQIP does require that plan. The Conservation Stewardship Program, on the other hand, does not. You do not have to have a written forest management plan to qualify for CSP. Although it's a little, usually what people do is they go to EQIP first to take care of most of the major restoration projects on their land. And then once those are done, what the Conservation Stewardship Program does is provide you additional incentive funding to support those projects and do a little bit more, go a little bit above and beyond the stewardship that you've already done through EQIP. So it almost kind of implies that you already have a plan. Regardless, of course, I would recommend that everybody have a forest management plan to guide your ongoing management. And in fact, both EQIP and NNRG's new cost share program can provide funding to you to hire a qualified forester to write a plan for you. So there's that added incentive to get a plan first.
All right, next one from Dave. Climate change considerations. Any thought about sourcing from Southern Oregon, Northern California stock?
Yeah, so I'll admit that even though we're advocates of assisted migration, that in my planting, I chose not to buy seed stock from Southern provenances, mostly because on my particular site, since I've got some of the best soils really in the state, the sort of clay loam that essentially is like a big brownie, it just sucks up moisture. I feel that this particular property is sort of a climate change refuge. Also, a lot of the areas that I was working on are east and north facing slopes, so tend to stay wet also. So microclimates that I think will be buffered to a certain degree from the impacts of climate change or longer, drier summers. So I didn't feel it was quite as necessary. What I did do though was used kind of a common adage, right tree in the right location. So for instance, the more drought tolerant trees like Douglas fir and pine, I planted a little bit on the higher elevation sites and the more exposed sites exposed to solar radiation. And then the less drought tolerant species in the hemlock, cedar, grand fir, I was definitely planting again on wetter sites and shadier sites where they can be protected. So I think that is a very specific climate adaptation strategy there, just making sure you get the right trees in the right locations.
Thanks. Next question on here from Scott, who is new to pine seedlings. The scenario here, purchased a few dozen Western white pine seedlings from my local conservation district and planned to plant them on the margins of a cleared area where they will receive substantial sunlight. Should I use seedling protection sleeves for that species, as there is a healthy deer population in the area?
Yeah, so white pine tends to be pretty browse resistant. So I've never caged pine. In fact, the only seedling that I routinely cage is just cedar. I found that Douglas fir will get browsed, but can usually tolerate browse. Grand fir tends not to get browsed. Hemlock doesn't really get browsed that much. Pine doesn't get browsed that much. If anything, as the trees grow up, deer will rub their antlers on anything. So they may not eat the cedar, or I mean, they may not eat the pine or grand fir or hemlock. They won't nibble on them, but they may rub their antlers on them. So that's just something to monitor. I think this is one of the reasons that we overplant. We plant at least 350 trees per acre. If all of those trees survived, you would have to pre-commercially thin it at some point. But you're kind of overplanting, anticipating mortality, whether it's drought induced or browse induced or what have you. But anyway, if you're just planting pine, I would not worry about caging them. If you see the deer are, bothering them in some other fashion, you could do that retroactively, but I wouldn't be inclined to proactively cage them.
Thanks, Kirk. All right, next one. What did you do with all the dropped trees in the thinning? Brush disposal, question mark.
Yeah, so pre-commercial thinning usually is just cut and drop, and you buck up the material enough to get it down below thigh high. That's largely to reduce fire risk and get as much of the material down on the ground as possible, so it rots as quickly as possible. That's what we did with the majority of it. Just cut, drop, buck it up. And then, like I mentioned, we did aggregate some of that material into these habitat structures. But given how few of structures there were, only 5 habitat piles and 20 constructed logs, that didn't use up a whole lot of that material. But typically in pre-commercial thinning, you're just leaving it there to rot and feed the soil. There is some concern about fire risk, in particular, I think when you're pre-commercially thinning in conifer stands, got a higher resin, more flammable material. And so, if you're in a high fire risk area, more of an urban area or something like that, you may want to think about some other mitigation strategies. And that could be just, ensuring that all that fine cut material is down and on the ground and not, up in the air, or even chipping some of that, biochar, any number of different kind of options like that to mitigate excessive slash. And EQIP also can pay for slash mitigation. So if in conversation with the USDA, you determine that there is going to be an excessive amount of slash that could result in a fire risk, they can provide an additional payment, additional practice for slash mitigation. And there's a range of things you can do, again, like chipping or removing it for firewood or biochar, or other options like that.
Is there a minimum acre restriction for EQIP?
There's not. No, even down to 1 acre qualifies for both a management plan and restoration practices.
All right, a couple more in here. What did you do specifically for carbon sequestration?
Yeah, so it was restoring conifers to a site that had a very low conifer stocking. So like I mentioned, it was dominant to naturally regenerated alder, so a short-lived species that wouldn't have a very good, long-term carbon sequestration potential. Basically, it was alder and brush, both poor performers in the carbon sequestration game. So we got a mix of conifers planted back in there that will be much longer lived and be able to suck up carbon over over hundreds of years rather than decades.
Okay, we've got another scenario for you. I've got a meadow that I have planted with a variety of evergreen and broadleaf trees, but of course, the alders have volunteered and are growing the fastest. Oops, just scrolled. They're about, sorry, something's blocking the number there. I can't see how old they are. And the tallest are about 15 to 20 feet. Sorry, there's just something, oh, 5 years old. Sorry, something's blocking it. How long should I let the alders grow before thinning them?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. What I would be looking at is signs of direct competition from the alder to whatever your preferred trees are. So, it sounds like you planted some trees out there, a mix of conifers and hardwoods, if I heard that right, which presumably then are your preferred trees. So as soon as you start seeing direct competition, the alder overtopping, say the conifers, or overtopping your other hardwoods, then you may want to start cutting out some of those alder. But what I'd encourage you to do is look, and if there are any gaps in there where alder has grown in, leave some of that alder. So ultimately, alder becomes part of your overall, diversity of trees out there. Alder obviously is a nitrogen fixer, great for building soil, native hardwood. So I think that should be part of the mix. But you'll just have to decide, what proportion of species you want. I'd say at 5 years, you could probably let them grow a little bit longer. But at the same time, given how young they are, the smaller they are, the easier they are to cut. The longer you let them go, the longer it takes to cut a bigger, older tree. But when I do pre-commercially thinning, I usually wait for kind of one of two things: either, again, direct competition with my preferred species, so I want to release that preferred species, or again, I look at the live crown ratio, and this is assuming that the stand is closed canopy and shade is beginning to cause those live crowns to recede. And when live crowns recede to about 40%, that's when you want to go in and either pre-commercially thin if the stand is young, or commercially thin if the stand is older. So I'm inclined here. It's 8:20. We've got 10 minutes left or so, and I'm happy to hang out a little bit longer. But if anybody wants to unmute themselves, I'd love to hear from folks, just like we heard there. Projects that you're working on. Is there something you've done that qualifies as forest restoration that you think would be useful for the group to hear about, or other examples, case studies that you want to throw out? But we'd love to make this a little more interactive, if you all want to play along. Anybody? People are tired and shy this evening.
Say it.
Okay, I'm kind of shy, but I guess I'll say something.
Awesome.
We're gonna embark on a new project this summer. We've been approved to do it's like a wildfire reduction program through DNR. And I saw it in one of the newsletters and just applied for it right off the bat. And they came right out, and they're funding us to do 10 acres at a time. So we have an 80-acre area, and we're going to be doing some pre-commercial thinning there. So we're kind of excited to do that. The last thinning we did was my husband, Eric, here. We're kind of dark in our living room. Yeah, we're in the dark. He did it about 32 years ago for our first 40 acres.
And what I like to say about that is the trees that I cut were extremely close together. It's like 900 trees per acre, whatever it was. It was like extremely thick, and so I cut them down when I thinned it, and they were just going down in mass. And I kept trees that were probably 3 inches in diameter with a very small crown, And now I can cut, I've got a portable sawmill and I can cut 2x12s out of most of them.
Awesome.
And all of the slash, I had huge amounts of slash. It looked like a war zone. It looked terrible. When the needles turned orange, it was horrible looking.
We
And
were so scared that we just lost all our forest.
And now you can't even see it. It's all just a beautiful forest of salal, big fir, I guess big fir, 1 foot diameter fir. But actually, when I cut them for lumber, the knots are extremely small. It's super nice wood, much better than you could ever buy in the store. Home Depot would be like, it's just no comparison. The knots are really small, super straight Doug fir.
So so we now have 80 acres more that's going to get thinned. That was planted. This first 40 acres was naturally seeded. So these trees are much bigger. What's their diameter? Like, I don't know.
Oh, 6 to 10 inches.
Yeah,
something like that.
they're much bigger than the first place.
But there's a lot of weird defective tops, trees that are too close together, alder and a bunch of different species growing up. It's a bit of a mess too. And I can really see where I'm going to have to go through and remove a lot of stuff. It's going to be a different type of tree as far as a sawmill tree, because they're going to be not the real tight rings per inch. I mean, if I cut my trees up here now, which I don't really do very often, but it's like, I don't know, 5 or 10 rings per inch. Up there, it's like 3.
Yeah.
It's like much less dense wood, but I can cut like well, that's kind of the different tree type, but they're growing like crazy. I mean, we've got the fissured bark, the crackly bark.
And they're about 20 years old?
On the 80 acres?
Yeah, 20.
Yeah, it's getting
20 to
towards
25.
20, but it's packed. So that's kind of a short history of what we're up to.
But the DNR program would be something to look into for people too.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I had intended to add that to the mix also, and I completely forgot about it. So that's great. Yeah, for folks that aren't familiar with that, if you're in Washington State, our state Department of Natural Resources has a funding program through their Forest Health Program that can help pay for activities that, well, improve forest health, reduce fire risk. So pre-commercial thinning, seedling release, also pruning, things like that. I don't believe it pays for wildlife habitat enhancement projects, but and it's got a few different kind of qualifications and parameters than EQIP does. But if anybody is interested in that, again, feel free to call me and I can talk through the different funding programs and your projects and figure out what's the right match for you. Anybody else have a anecdote or project example they want to share, or question for that matter? There's got to be something out there. This is a big
Did you
group
say both EQIP and CSP are federal programs?
Yeah, they're all funded by the Farm Bill. So they're Farm Bill is what renewed every 4 years or so. And the programs are embedded in the USDA, specifically the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And yeah, since they're federal programs, they're available to rural landowners all across the country. So obviously not just the Pacific Northwest or Washington State. You would go to the local USDA office that's closest to your land, and then talk with the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, about these funding programs. They also apply to agricultural land, so it's not just forest land. So any rural landowner can qualify for funding to do restoration on their land. So Carla, Mike, if there is any restoration needs on his land, for instance, could contact the NRCS and have them go out, walk the land with them, and could implement some activities.
All right. Yeah, it's worth looking into. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Yeah, I don't mind ending on time, but I also, I don't know, I'm kind of fired up here. I want to keep playing what if here. Anybody else have any scenarios? Play Stump the Chump. Give me something hard.
The hand, Dave?
Hey, yeah, thanks. Dave Galvin here from Sahali Ski Club. My 80 acres of forest is up at Snoqualmie Pass at 3,000 feet. And I've really loved the expertise and the help that I've gotten from NNRG. My question is, as climate change starts to reduce our snowpack and all of that, I'm starting to see summer drought and heat damage to my trees. I'm just wondering if you have any advice at that high elevation about what we should be doing to put new trees in, given, like a 50 or 100 year horizon.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we're expecting is that the tree zones are going to be changing. So you're up at a higher elevation. You're in the the white fir, silver fir, grand fir kind of zone up there. And what we're expecting to see is the Douglas fir zone kind of push up, kind of rise up in elevation. So Douglas fir being obviously more drought tolerant, and a little bit less sensitive than the silver fir or the true firs. I would be starting to consider planting more Douglas fir on your site there, and even consider maybe some yellow cedar, western red cedar up there, and beginning to transition the species.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's what I hope to do. And so I'm trying to start to bring in some of those species just as you name.
And the other thing too that you could try is, if you can find seed sources from Eastern Washington, Oregon, of course, Southern Oregon, Northern California, the classic assisted migration, you might be able to get away with, continuing to plant some true firs, but get them from, the Siskiyous or the Klamath or something like that, the Sierra Nevadas, and just small numbers, and just start kind of testing them out and see how they do. Granted, this is a decades-long proposition, but that's also one of the kind of caveats with assisted migration, is not to go with 100% of offsite seed stock, but a small percentage of your planting stock.
Can you guys give us some specific references to how to find those seeds?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the U.S. Forest Service has a website called the Seed Lot Selection Tool. And if you Google that, Seed Lot Selection Tool, it'll do a couple of things. It'll show you where in the Western U.S. there is a current climate that approximates what our climate, or your climate is expected to be, say, in 40 years. So for instance, it'll model out, what, the climate, the microclimate, at Snoqualmie Pass is going to be in 40, 50 years, and then tell you, well, today that climate is represented in, Sacramento or what have you. And then you can look in that area and find tree nurseries, reforestation nurseries, and buy seed stock from them.
Cool. Thanks, Kirk.
Yeah, happy to take a few more. Oh yeah, Carl and Lorna, I see your hand up. Great, love to hear from you.
Yes, we're excited about getting into the equip and starting with the forest plan and everything. But I was wondering, is there a similar kind of thing where all the different possible things are kind of listed in the forest management, the things that you can do? I mean, because I know about the piles, and I learned now there's 3 different ways to take the residue wood, But is there a way to find out about, say, building birdhouses or that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think I know what you're asking. So what are the kind of list of projects that EQIP funds, something like that, so you can get a sense of
Yes.
yeah, yeah, there is, as a matter of fact. And now that I think about it, Laura, we need to collaborate to get this up on our website. But I put together and we'll get this on our website here in the next couple of days. I put together a little summary sheet that lists all of the most common EQIP and CSP practices that small woodland owners would be inclined to use on their land. So it shows those projects and then what the payment rates are for them. And I usually just bring that to workshops and hand that out. But we'll get that posted to our website here in the next couple of days. And let's see.
That sounds great.
On our website, we have a page that's dedicated to EQIP and cost share funding. And so we'll add it to that. And so you can take a look at that in a couple of days. And also, if anybody wants a copy of that, just send me an email and say, hey, Kirk, send us that EQIP CSP summary you talked about last night. And I'll send it to you right away by email.
Well, thank you.
Well, happy to take one or two more. If anybody's got any other either questions or scenarios. Yeah, Scott, got the fist.
I'm not sure how to raise my hand electronically here, but I have an area of about 14 acres that was clear cut about 10 years ago and replanted with Doug fir, fairly widely replanted, but it's basically a sea of blackberries with the firs sticking up through them now. They have gotten up high enough.
I know well.
Do I just wait now, or is there anything that I could or should do with the blackberries?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say if you have at least 2 to 3 feet of tree growth, the leader of the tree, the top third of that tree is above the brush or above the blackberry, you're probably fine. My one concern is, of course, blackberry wants to use trees as a trellis, climb up and can grab onto a leader, pull it down, break it, what have you. So I guess I would look at that and see, is the blackberry starting to climb up those trees and compromise them more from a, physical integrity standpoint? Then you may want to have an intervention. But like at our land now, we've been doing this, cutting back the brush for, 3 years or so. All that brush is still there. All that blackberry is still there. But now the seedlings, the cedar, Doug fir, are 3-4 feet above the blackberry and the brush. And I think we're done. We refer to that as free to grow. The seedlings now are free to grow above that brush. So again, usually if you've got 2 or 3 feet above the brush, you consider your seedling free to grow. So that would be my metric.
Okay, cool, thanks.
One last anecdote, question, anything? All right. Well, folks, really enjoyed having you join us again for our March Fireside Chat. We'll be back, of course, in April. No idea what the topic is. We tend to make these things up as we go along. If anybody wants us to cover a specific topic, either put it in the chat or send me an email, and we'll give it due consideration, and love to be responsive to what people are interested in. So thanks again for joining us. Check out our new book. And again, if you'd like NNRG to send a forester out to walk your land with you and evaluate anything from forest restoration to ecologically based timber harvesting, we're happy to come out and for free and walk around and give you our 2 cents worth. So have a good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you.